Every young man who walked into the pits had the same look in his eyes, hungry, eager, convinced that this was where fortunes were made. And they weren't wrong, fortunes were made here. But you want to know what I noticed about every single one of them? Every bright-eyed kid who blew up inside of a year. They could tell you exactly how much money they made on their best trade, down to the dollar. But ask them how much they lost last month. They'd get quiet. They'd look at the floor. And that silence right there, told me everything I needed to know. I spent decades in and around these markets. Started as a runner on the floor in the late 20s, just a kid fetching orders, watching men make and lose more money in an afternoon than my father earned in a year. And in all that time, I learned to tell the difference between a man who would last and a man who wouldn't. You could do it in about 5 minutes of conversation. Because the men who wouldn't last, they talked about profits. They talked about the trade that doubled their account in a week. They talked about the tip they got that paid off beautifully. They replayed their wins like a ball player replaying a home run over and over. And every time they told the story, somehow the trade got a little bigger, the profit got a little fatter, and their losses? Those were bad luck, bad timing, a market that shouldn't have moved that way. It was never them. It was never a decision they made. It was the market being unfair, or their broker being slow, or some noise they couldn't have predicted. Now, I'm not saying those things never happen. Markets are unpredictable sometimes. Brokers do make mistakes. But here's what I learned. The men who talked about their losses, the ones who could sit down and walk through exactly what went wrong, trade by trade, decision by decision. Those were the men who were still around 10 years later, still trading, still solvent, still learning. The others? Gone. Accounts blown, moved on to something else, convinced the markets were rigged against them. See, there's a reason for this, and it took me years to understand it. When you talk about your profits, you're reinforcing a story you're telling yourself. A story where you're smart, where you made the right call, where you understood something the market didn't. It feels good. It builds your confidence. But confidence built on stories about your wins? That confidence is hollow. It's a house of cards. Because the moment the market humbles you, and it will, that confidence shatters, and you're left with nothing but the wreckage and the question, how did I get this so wrong? But when you talk about your losses, you're doing something different. You're investigating. You're asking hard questions. Why did I take that trade? What signal was I responding to? Was it real, or did I imagine it because I wanted to be in the market? Did I ignore my stop? And if so, why? Was I chasing? Was I trying to get even? Was I emotional? These aren't comfortable questions. No trader wants to sit in a room and pick apart every mistake he made. But the professionals, the real ones, they don't have a choice. Because they know that their losses are data. They're information. They're the raw material of improvement. I watched a man named Fitzgerald, sharp trader, good instincts, blow up his account in 1937 because he couldn't stop talking about the one trade that made him 40% in a month. He'd walk around the pit telling anyone who'd listen about that trade, how he knew it was coming, how he'd timed it perfectly, how he was a natural. 6 months later, he was broke. He'd taken that same overconfidence into different markets, different conditions, and the market had punished him for it, severely. I asked him about it years later, after he'd rebuilt and actually become a decent trader again. I said, "What changed?" And you know what he told me? He said, "I stopped being proud of what I was right about, and I started being humble about what I was wrong about." That's the whole thing right there. The professionals in the pits, the men who lasted, who built real wealth, who didn't blow up when volatility spiked or when the unexpected happened. They were obsessed with their losses because losses were their education. Every loss was a tuition payment in the school of the markets. And the men who paid attention to that tuition, who studied what they paid for, who actually learned something instead of just moving on, those men advanced. The beginners? They wanted to skip the education. They wanted to talk about the one time they got lucky and make it sound like genius. They wanted the payoff without understanding the principle. And the markets don't work that way. The markets are patient. They have all the time in the world, and they will take your money as many times as you're willing to hand it over while pretending you don't need to learn. Here's another thing. When you're obsessing about your losses, you're naturally thinking about risk. You're thinking about position size. You're thinking about what would have happened if the loss had been twice as big. You're thinking like someone who understands that survival comes first, and profits are just what's left over after you've survived. But when you're obsessing about your profits, you're thinking about what you could make. You're thinking bigger, faster. You're already spending the money in your head, and you're not thinking about the flip side, the downside, at all. You're not thinking about the loss that could happen. You're not thinking about position sizing for a worst-case scenario. You're thinking like someone who's already convinced the upside is guaranteed. And that's the trader who doesn't make it. I remember the crash of '29. I was young, but I was there. I watched men who'd been in the market for 20, 30 years get wiped out in a single day. A single day. And you know what was interesting about it? The men who survived, the ones who didn't lose everything, they weren't the ones who'd made the most money in the bull run. They were the ones who'd been paranoid about their losses, the ones who'd been thinking about downsides, the ones who'd kept some powder dry, who hadn't leveraged themselves to the hilt, who'd been thinking about what could go wrong instead of what could go right. And in that moment, when the market turned, they were still there, still solvent, still able to take advantage of the chaos that followed. The men who'd been talking about their profits for the last 5 years, most of them weren't. This is why professional traders talk about losses. This is what they're obsessed over. It's not that they don't want to make money, of course they do, but they understand something the beginners don't. The only reason you get to make money is because you first stay alive. You manage your risk. You understand your downside. You know what you can afford to lose. And every time you don't learn from a loss, every time you brush it off and move on to the next trade, you're setting yourself up to learn the exact same lesson again, except the second time it'll cost you more. The professionals talk about losses because losses are where the work is. Losses are where you find out what you're actually made of. Losses are where you learn what you thought you knew but actually didn't know. Losses are the tuition. And the men who pay attention in class, they're the ones who graduate. The others? Well, they just keep paying tuition without ever learning anything. So the next time you're in a conversation about trading, pay attention to what the person is talking about. Are they replaying their wins? Telling you about the trade that made them rich? Confident that they've figured out some edge nobody else has seen? Then you know. You know exactly how much time that person has left in the market. Maybe they'll get lucky and quit before it goes bad, but the odds aren't in their favor. But if someone starts talking about a trade they got wrong, really talking about it, asking questions, learning from it, then you're listening to someone who might actually make it. Someone who understands that the market doesn't care about your ego. Someone who understands that the only edge you have is the willingness to be wrong, to admit it, and to make sure you're never quite as wrong the same way twice. That's the difference between a professional and a beginner. And it all comes down to this. Professionals talk about losses. Beginners talk about profits.